The late afternoon sun cut through the tall, dusty windows of the old community center, casting long, golden shapes across the floor. It was that quiet time of day when the city outside seemed to muffle its own noise, just for a little while. Inside, the air smelled of lemon polish and old paper, a scent that felt like stepping back in time. For a 16-year-old girl named Sophie, this place was more than just a building. It was the only spot in the entire city where she felt like she could actually breathe. Sophie walked softly down the main hallway, her backpack slung over one shoulder. It was heavy with textbooks, but the weight didn't bother her much right now. Her mind was focused on the large double doors at the end of the corridor. She knew she wasn't really supposed to be here. The center had closed its regular hours at 5 o'clock, and the clock on the wall already showed 5:30. But the side entrance down by the recycling bins had been left unlocked, just like it was every Tuesday. The maintenance crew was usually too busy chatting near their trucks to notice a quiet girl slipping inside. She pushed through the swinging doors that led into the main auditorium. The room was huge and empty, filled with rows of fabric seats that looked like a sea of dark red velvet. At the front of the room, all alone on the large wooden stage, sat the grand piano. It wasn't the fanciest piano in the world. The black paint was chipped in a few places near the legs, and some of the pedals squeaked if you pressed them too hard. But to Sophie, it was perfect. At home, there was no room for a piano. Her family lived in a small, noisy apartment where you could hear the neighbors arguing through the thin walls and the traffic roaring by non-stop. Practicing there was impossible. She climbed the few steps up to the stage and sat down on the bench. The wood felt cool against her legs. Sophie took a deep breath and opened her bag, pulling out a stack of loose sheet music. She smoothed the papers out on the music rack. Her hands were a little cold, but she knew they would warm up soon enough. She wasn't here to play her homework assignments, and she wasn't here to play the happy pop songs her friends liked. She was here because she had a scholarship audition coming up in 2 weeks, and she was terrified. It was a prestigious music school in the city, the kind of place where kids who had been taking lessons since they were 3 years old went to study. Sophie had only started playing seriously when she was 12, after a teacher at her middle school noticed her tapping out rhythms on her desk. She had talent, the teachers said, but she didn't have the expensive training or the fancy background. The scholarship was her only shot. She placed her fingers on the keys, feeling the smooth ivory and the sharp edges of the black keys. She closed her eyes for a second and pictured the piece she was about to play. It was a complicated, stormy piece by Rachmaninoff. It required strong hands and a lot of emotion. It started slow and sad, then built up into a thunder of sound, like a wave crashing against a cliff. Sophie began to play. At first, the sound was hesitant. The room was so quiet that the first few notes seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the high ceiling. But as she got into the rhythm, her confidence grew. Her left hand began to mark the steady beat, deep and low, while her right hand danced up the scale. The music filled the empty auditorium. It swallowed up the silence and replaced it with something alive. She forgot about the heavy backpack on the floor. She forgot about the math test she had the next day. She forgot about the fact that she was technically breaking the rules by being in the building. The only thing that mattered was the music. She leaned into the piano, her body swaying slightly with the melody. She played the soft parts with extreme care, touching the keys as if they were made of glass. Then, when the music called for it, she struck the keys harder, letting the sound grow loud and bold. This was her safe space. Nobody could judge her here. Nobody could tell her she wasn't good enough. In this empty hall, With the dust motes dancing in the beams of light, she was a master. She felt a surge of energy in her chest, a feeling that was part excitement and part nervousness. She thought about the judges at the audition. She imagined them sitting in these red velvet seats, listening to her with stern faces. She wanted to make them feel something. She wanted to make them sit up and take notice. The song reached its difficult middle section. Sophie's fingers moved faster, flying over the keys in a blur of motion. She hit a wrong note, a sharp, discordant sound that made her flinch, but she didn't stop. She kept playing, pushing through the mistake. In music, like in life, she had learned that you just had to keep going. You couldn't stop and apologize, you had to play right through the error and make the next note sound beautiful. The acoustics in the old hall were amazing. The sound seemed to wrap around her, rich and full. It was a completely different experience from playing on the electric keyboard she had at home. On that keyboard, the sound was flat and digital. Here, every note had a vibration that she could feel in the floorboards and in the tips of her fingers. She was pouring everything she had into this rehearsal. All her stress, her hopes, her fears about the future, they were all flowing out of her and into the piano. Sophie was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the heavy door at the back of the room click open. She didn't hear the sound of hard-soled shoes clicking against the tiled floor. She didn't see the tall figure standing in the shadows of the doorway, watching her. She just played on, her eyes closed, her face a mask of concentration, totally unaware that her sanctuary was about to be invaded. The music swelled to a crescendo, filling the vast room, drowning out the world, but it couldn't drown out the footsteps that were slowly making their way down the center aisle toward the stage. The music swelled to a massive, thundering finish, the final chords hanging in the air and vibrating against the high ceiling of the auditorium. Sophie sat frozen for a moment, her hands hovering over the keys, letting the sound fade away into complete silence. She let out a long breath, her shoulders dropping as the tension left her body. She felt good. She felt like she had actually conquered the difficult piece. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth as she reached down to grab her water bottle from the floor. "You are trespassing." The voice was deep, sharp, and cut through the quiet air like a knife. It wasn't a shout, but it carried a heavy authority that made Sophie jump so hard she nearly tipped the bench over. The water bottle slipped from her hand and rolled across the stage with a hollow thumping sound. Her heart skipped a beat as she snapped her head around to look at the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the stage, near the steps, was a man. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He was wearing a long, dark coat and a crisp gray suit. Even from this distance, Sophie could feel the waves of cold disapproval coming off him. He wasn't looking at her with curiosity, he was looking at her the way a teacher looks at a student who has just broken a serious rule. I'm sorry," Sophie stammered, her voice squeaking a little. She scrambled to stand up, grabbing her backpack as if it could shield her. "I didn't know anyone was here. I was just leaving." The man didn't move an inch. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at her with narrowed eyes. "This building is closed to the public at 5 o'clock, he said. His tone was flat, devoid of any warmth. "It is now nearly 6 o'clock. You are violating the city's curfew for public buildings, and you are using property that does not belong to you." Sophie felt her face turn hot with embarrassment. She hated getting in trouble. She was the kind of kid who always followed the rules, who always turned her homework in on time. Being caught like this felt like a nightmare. "I know, sir," she said quickly, fumbling with the zipper of her bag. The side door was open, and I just needed a piano. I have a scholarship audition soon, and I don't have one at home. She hoped that mentioning the scholarship would make him understand. She hoped it would make him see that she wasn't here to vandalize the place or cause trouble. She was just a girl who loved music. But the man's expression didn't soften. If anything, he looked even more annoyed. He stepped up onto the stage, his shoes making a loud clicking sound on the wooden floor. "That is not an excuse," he said sternly. "Rules exist for a reason: liability, security, safety. Do you have any idea what would happen if you got hurt in here? The center is already struggling to stay open. We cannot afford lawsuits because students decide to break in after hours." "I didn't break in," Sophie protested weakly, though she knew it sounded like a technicality. "I promise I'll leave right now." "You will?" he said. He pointed a finger toward the exit. "And you will not come back here unless you have a signed permit and a scheduled appointment. I run the board for this center, and I will not tolerate unauthorized use of the facilities." Sophie nodded frantically. She started shoving her sheet music into her bag, her hands shaking so much that she couldn't get the papers to fit straight. The man watched her the entire time, making no move to help her. It felt like the longest few minutes of her life. She could feel his judgment pressing down on her. She felt small, and she felt foolish for thinking she could just borrow the space without consequences. Finally, she managed to stuff everything into her bag. She shouldered it and turned to leave, keeping her head down. She just wanted to get past him and out the door. She wanted to run away and hide. "Wait," the man said. Sophie stopped, her heart pounding again. Did he want to call her parents? Was he going to call the police? She turned back slowly, terrified of what he was going to say. "You dropped this," he said. He was looking down at the floor near his feet. A single sheet of paper had escaped from her messy pile-up earlier. It had slid all the way across the stage and was resting against the toe of his shiny leather shoe. Sophie let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. "Oh. Thanks." She stepped forward to grab it, but the man bent down first. He moved slowly, his joints stiff, and picked up the paper. He intended to just hand it to her and send her on her way, but as he straightened up, his eyes caught the title written at the top of the page in Sophie's neat handwriting. He froze. The room, which had been filled with the sound of Sophie's frantic packing, went completely still. The man stared at the paper. His grip on the edge of the sheet tightened. The look of annoyance on his face cracked, just for a second, replaced by something else. Confusion. Shock. Sophie reached out to take it. That's just some extra music I found," she mumbled. "Can I have it back, please?" The man didn't let go. He looked from the paper up to Sophie's face, his eyes searching hers. The anger was gone, replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. "Where," he asked, his voice much quieter than before, almost a whisper, "did you get this music?" The air in the large auditorium seemed to stand completely still. Sophie stood frozen on the stage, her hands still half reaching out for the paper. The man's grip on the sheet music was tight, his knuckles turning white against the paper. He wasn't looking at her like a troublemaker anymore. The cold authority that had radiated from him just moments ago had vanished, replaced by a look of intense confusion and something else that looked a lot like pain. "I asked you a question," the man said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't yell, but the demand in his tone was heavier than before. "Where did you get this?" Sophie pulled her hand back, feeling very small under his stare. She didn't understand why a simple piece of paper would upset him so much. It was just a song she had found. I didn't steal it, she stammered, her voice shaking. I promise I didn't steal it. The man closed his eyes for a second and took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. When he opened them again, he softened his voice, though it still trembled slightly. I am not accusing you of theft. I just need to know. That music, it is not something you would find in a standard store. It is a very specific arrangement. Please, tell me where you found it. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat feeling dry. She looked down at her sneakers, wishing the floor would just open up and let her disappear. She felt uncomfortable seeing this older man, who had been so tough just a minute ago, looking so vulnerable. It felt like she was intruding on a private moment she didn't understand. I found it in a book, she said quietly. About 6 months ago. There was a library fundraiser at the downtown branch. They were selling old books to get money for new computers. I bought a thick, hardcover book about classical music history. It was really old and dusty. When I got home and opened it to look at the pictures, this paper fell out from between the pages. The man stared at her, processing every word. A library fundraiser, he repeated, almost to himself. Downtown branch. Yes, Sophie nodded. It was just tucked inside, like someone was using it as a bookmark and forgot about it. The paper is really thin, see, and the handwriting on the top is kind of faded. I thought it was a piece of sheet music from a long time ago. The man looked back down at the paper in his hand. He ran his thumb gently over the handwritten title at the top. Sophie could see his hand was shaking now. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. The sight made her nervousness spike into a different kind of fear, not fear of getting in trouble, but fear that she had done something terrible by keeping this paper. Is it yours? She asked cautiously. Did I take something that belongs to you? I am sorry. I didn't know. I just liked the melody. I can give it back. She reached out to take it back, feeling guilty. But the man shook his head slowly. He didn't let go. He held the paper as if it were made of glass, the most precious thing in the world. It doesn't belong to me, he whispered, his voice cracking. It belonged to my wife. The words hung in the vast, empty room. Sophie felt her eyes go wide. She looked at the man, really seeing him for the first time. She noticed the deep lines around his eyes and the silver hair that was neatly combed. He looked tired, incredibly tired. This wasn't just a grumpy board member or a strict judge. This was a person who had lost someone he loved. She wrote this, he said, looking up at Sophie, his eyes watery. Her name was Elena. She was a music teacher. A brilliant one. She passed away 5 years ago. I thought I had lost all of her compositions. He stopped, choking up slightly, and had to look away to compose himself. When she died, there was a mix-up with the movers. Boxes of her things were accidentally taken to a donation center. By the time I tracked them down, most of them were gone. I looked everywhere. I never thought to look inside a random book at a library sale. Sophie felt a lump form in her own throat. She suddenly understood why he had been so harsh when he first walked in. Maybe he came here because it reminded him of her. Maybe this building, this music hall, was filled with memories he couldn't escape. She felt a wave of sympathy wash over her, pushing away her earlier fear of getting in trouble. I'm so sorry, Sophie said softly. I didn't know. I didn't mean to upset you. I just play it because, Well, it sounds beautiful, but it also sounds lonely. I wanted to get it right for the audition. I wanted to show the judges that I can feel the music, not just play the notes. The man looked at the paper again, then back at the girl standing in front of him. He realized that this teenager, this trespasser he had tried to kick out just minutes ago, was the only link he had to his wife's artistic soul in years. It was a strange twist of fate that almost made him dizzy. "Can you play it?" he asked suddenly. The demand was gone from his voice. Now, he sounded almost like a child asking for a favor. "Excuse me," Sophie asked, surprised. "The song," the man said. He took a step closer to her. "I haven't heard the song in 5 years. Not since the day before she died. I don't even remember what it sounds like anymore. I look at the notes, but I can't hear the melody in my head. Can you play it for me right now?" Sophie looked at the piano, then back at the man. She knew she should probably leave. She had already been caught trespassing. She had already caused this man emotional pain by bringing up the past. But looking at his face, the desperation in his eyes, she knew she couldn't just walk out. Music wasn't just about notes or passing an audition. Sometimes, music was about connecting people. I can try," she said. "I haven't practiced it as much as the other pieces. It's tricky. The middle part is hard." "That's all right," the man said quickly. "Please. Just play it." He slowly walked over to the side of the stage, away from the piano bench, but he didn't head for the exit. He sat down heavily on a wooden chair that was usually reserved for the trumpet players. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his collar, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked like he was preparing for a church service, or a funeral, but his eyes were fixed on Sophie, waiting. Sophie took a deep breath. She walked back to the piano bench and sat down. The wood felt the same, cool and hard, but the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Before, she was playing to prove herself, to beat the odds. Now, she was playing to heal a stranger's heart. She took the sheet music from his hand gently. "Here," she said, placing it on the rack. "I will play it for you." The man nodded, his eyes never leaving her hands. Sophie placed her fingers on the keys. She was nervous, but not the same nervous butterflies she had before. This was a heavier feeling, a sense of responsibility. She closed her eyes for a second to find the right headspace, remembering the sad, sweet melody she had found on that old paper. Then, she began to play. The room was silent as Sophie placed her fingers on the keys. She felt a weight on her shoulders that wasn't there before. This wasn't about showing off her technique or practicing for a score anymore. It was about something much bigger. It was about a memory. The man sitting a few feet away was watching her with eyes that looked tired and desperate, like he was waiting for a lifeline. Sophie took a deep breath to steady her nerves. She looked at the faded notes on the paper one last time, then closed her eyes. She wanted to play this from the heart, not just read the ink off the page. She remembered the first time she played the melody, how it sounded to her. It was gentle, like a lullaby, but it had a deep sadness underneath it. She pressed down on the first key. The sound was clear and soft in the large, empty hall. The note hung in the air for a moment before fading away. Sophie began to play, her hands moving slowly and carefully. The melody was simple, not flashy like the loud Rachmaninoff piece she had played earlier. It didn't need speed or power. It needed touch. It needed feeling. As the song flowed, Sophie tried to put herself in the shoes of the woman who wrote it. She imagined a mother figure, someone kind and loving, writing a song for someone she cared about very much. She played the phrases with a tenderness that surprised even her. The notes rose and fell like a quiet wave, drifting through the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. The man, whose name she still didn't know, sat perfectly still on the chair. At first, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, staring intently at her hands. But as the music continued, his posture changed. His shoulders dropped. He closed his eyes tight, as if the bright light was hurting him, or perhaps to stop the tears from falling. For the first few minutes, the only sounds in the auditorium were the piano and the quiet hum of the air conditioning in the background. Sophie focused entirely on the dynamics. She made the soft parts barely a whisper, so the man would have to lean in to hear, and she let the crescendos swell just enough to feel full, but never loud or aggressive. She hit a small section in the middle that was a little more complicated. The left hand played a rolling pattern while the right hand carried the tune. Sophie felt her fingers stumble once, just for a split second. She winced internally, worried she had ruined the moment. She glanced quickly at the man, terrified he would be disappointed. But he didn't open his eyes. He didn't scold her. He just sat there, a faint smile touching his lips. It wasn't a smile of judgment, it was a smile of recognition. He was hearing the song again, not as a critic, but as a husband. That realization made Sophie relax. She let go of her own fear of making mistakes and let the music take over. She smoothed out the rhythm and kept playing, navigating the song with a newfound confidence. The acoustics of the old hall made the piano sound warm and rich. Every vibration seemed to wrap around the listener. Sophie imagined that this was exactly how the music was meant to be heard. She wondered if the woman, Elena, had played here too. Maybe she had sat on this very bench, looking out at these empty red seats, imagining the future. As Sophie approached the end of the piece, the melody became simpler again, winding down to a peaceful finish. She slowed the tempo, letting each note ring out clearly. She played the final chord, a series of 3 notes that sounded like a question being answered. She held her hands on the keys, letting the sound vibrate against her fingertips until the room was truly silent again. She didn't let go immediately. She kept her head down, listening to the quiet, giving the man his time. From the side of the stage, she heard a shaky breath. It sounded like a sob that was trying to be held back. Sophie waited, her heart rate slowing down. After a long moment, she heard the rustle of fabric as the man shifted in his seat. She turned slowly on the bench to look at him. The judge looked older now, but lighter. The hard lines of his face seemed to have softened. He was dabbing his eyes with a white handkerchief he had pulled from his pocket. He took a deep, ragged breath and folded the cloth, putting it away. When he looked at Sophie, his eyes were red-rimmed but clear. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough, not cold, and sharp like before. It sounded human. It sounded grateful. Sophie gave him a small, shy smile. "You're welcome. It's a beautiful song. I'm sorry if I didn't play it perfectly. The middle part is tricky." The man shook his head slowly. "No," he said firmly. "You played it perfectly. Better than perfect. You played it with the right feeling. That is something I haven't heard in a very long time." He stood up slowly, using his knees to push himself out of the chair. He walked over to the piano, standing next to the bench. He didn't look like the scary authority figure from the hallway anymore. He looked like a grandfather. He looked down at the sheet music. "My wife wrote this for our granddaughter," he said softly, staring at the handwriting. "She was pregnant when she wrote it? But, we lost the baby before he was born. And then, a year later, we lost Elena to an illness. I thought this music was gone forever. I thought the last piece of her soul that was left in this world was lost in a box somewhere." He turned to look at Sophie. "You found it? You kept it safe? And you brought it back to life?" Sophie felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't realized the significance of the crumpled paper she carried in her backpack for months. "I just liked the music," she said again. "I felt connected to it. I don't know why." "Talent speaks to talent," the man said. "And a kind heart recognizes a kind heart. You have a gift, young lady." He looked around the empty hall, then back at her. "I am sorry I was so rude to you earlier. I have been angry for a long time. I come here sometimes because it is quiet, but mostly because I am lonely. It is hard to be in a house that feels empty. When I heard you playing, I was annoyed at the noise. But now I realize you were the one thing I needed to hear." Sophie was taken aback by his honesty. It was strange to think that this intimidating man was actually just lonely. "It's okay," she said. "I know I shouldn't have been here. I was wrong to sneak in." "Perhaps," the man said, a small twinkle returning to his eyes. "But maybe some rules are meant to be bent if the reason is right." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. From it, he took a small business card. He hesitated for a second, looking at the card, then handed it to Sophie. "My name is Arthur," he said. "Arthur Sterling. I am a judge, yes. But I am also the chairman of the board for the center. If you need a place to practice, you do not need to sneak in the side door anymore. You come to the front desk. You tell them I gave you permission. Any time this building is open, the piano is yours for practice." Sophie's jaw dropped. She looked at the card. It had his name and a court address on it. "Really, you mean that?" "I do," Arthur said. "You have a scholarship audition coming up, didn't you say?" "Yes, in 2 weeks. I'm really nervous about it." "Don't be," Arthur said. "If you play with that much heart, they would be fools not to take you. However, just to be sure, I will write you a letter of recommendation. I have served on committees for the Arts Council. I know what they look for. My words might carry some weight." Sophie couldn't believe what she was hearing. 10 minutes ago, she was being kicked out. Now, she was being offered unlimited practice time and a recommendation letter from a judge. It felt like a dream. "I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Just promise me one thing," Arthur said, placing his hand gently on the top of the piano. "Promise me you will keep learning this song. And maybe, one day, when you are famous and playing on a big stage, you will think of her." "I promise," Sophie said sincerely. Arthur nodded. He looked at the clock on the wall. "It is getting late. You should go home before your parents worry. I need to lock up." Sophie gathered her things quickly, but with much less panic than before. She packed her sheet music away carefully, treating the paper with even more respect now. She put Arthur's card safely in her wallet. She slung her backpack over her shoulder and walked to the edge of the stage. "Good night, Arthur," she said. "Good night, Sophie," he replied. He learned her name just by listening to her play. "Good luck." She walked down the center aisle, toward the double doors. When she reached the exit, She paused and looked back. Arthur was sitting on the piano bench, his hands hovering over the keys, not playing, just touching them. He looked peaceful. Sophie pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city was loud again, cars honking and people rushing home. But Sophie felt calm. She had a scholarship to win, but now, she had something else. She had a song that meant something. And she had a friend in a high place. She walked toward the bus stop with a little spring in her step, ready for whatever came next. The 2 weeks that followed were a whirlwind of practice and nerves for Sophie, but everything felt different now. She didn't have to sneak around anymore. Every day after school, she would walk straight to the front desk of the community center. The receptionist, a lady named Mrs. Higgins, would always smile and hand her the key to the auditorium the moment she walked in. "Mr. Sterling called ahead," she would say. "Go right on in." It was a strange and wonderful feeling for Sophie to walk through the main entrance with her head held high. She didn't have to hide in the shadows or worry about getting caught. She would unlock the double doors, step onto the stage, and practice for hours. The dusty, old hall had become her second home. Arthur, the judge, didn't come back to watch her every day. He had a busy job at the courthouse, but he stopped by twice during that first week. He never interrupted her playing. He would just sit in his usual spot in the back row, listening with his eyes closed. Sometimes, when she finished a song, he would offer a small nod of approval or a quiet piece of advice about her posture. He was strict, but he was kind. He treated her not like a kid who was breaking the rules, but like a serious musician. The day of the scholarship audition finally arrived on a crisp Saturday morning. Sophie stood outside the prestigious music school, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The building was intimidating, made of white stone and tall glass. Around her were other students her age, all holding instrument cases and looking just as terrified. Most of them were dressed in expensive clothes, talking about their private tutors and the grand pianos they had at home. Sophie tightened her grip on her backpack. She felt like she didn't belong there, even with Arthur's letter tucked safely in her folder. When her name was finally called, she walked into the audition room. It was a small, intimate studio with 3 judges sitting behind a long table. They looked tired, they had been listening to students play all day. They didn't smile when she walked in. One of them, a woman with sharp glasses, simply pointed to the piano. "Whenever you are ready." Sophie sat down at the shiny, black concert grand. It was a much nicer piano than the one at the community center, but for a second, Sophie missed the beat-up old instrument she had been practicing on. She took a deep breath. She thought about Arthur. She thought about his late wife. She thought about the connection they had made in that empty hall. She started with her classical piece, the Rachmaninoff. Her fingers flew across the keys, loud and fast. She played with power, putting all her energy into it. When she finished, the room was silent. The judges wrote things down on their clipboards, their faces blank. "Now," the woman with the glasses said, looking over her spectacles. "We see here that you have prepared a contemporary piece as well, something original." "Yes," Sophie said softly. She pulled out the faded, handwritten sheet music. It was wrinkled at the edges from being in her bag for so long. "This is a song called Elena's Lullaby. It was written by a music teacher." She placed the paper on the stand. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining Arthur sitting in the back row of the dark auditorium. She began to play. The song was simple, but it filled the small room. The aggressive, competitive energy Sophie had felt outside the door seemed to melt away. The melody was pure and honest. She didn't try to show off her speed. She just played the music, letting the notes tell the story of the love that was put into writing them. She played the sadness of losing someone and the beauty of remembering them. She poured her heart into every measure, just as she had done for Arthur that night. When she played the final chord and let her hands fall to her lap, the silence in the room felt heavy, but not in a bad way. It felt like the judges were holding their breath. Sophie looked up. The woman with the sharp glasses wasn't writing anymore. She was just looking at Sophie, her expression softened. The judge in the middle, an older man with gray hair, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He cleared his throat. "That was quite moving," the middle judge said. "Who is the composer? I am not familiar with the name." "It was written by the wife of a friend of mine," Sophie said simply. "She passed away a few years ago. He lost the music, and I found it in a used book. I play it to keep her memory alive." The three judges looked at each other. They had heard hundreds of talented kids play today. Kids who could play faster and louder than Sophie. But they hadn't heard many kids who could make a room feel so human. "Thank you, Sophie," the woman said, giving her a genuine smile. "You may go." She walked out of the room, her legs feeling like jelly. She didn't know if she played well enough, but she knew she played it true. 3 days later, a letter arrived at her apartment. It was a thick envelope with the music school's logo on it. Her hands shook as she opened it. She read the words "Congratulations" and screamed out loud, dropping the envelope on the kitchen table. She had gotten the scholarship. She had done it. Her mother and father hugged her, laughing and crying. They were so proud of their daughter. But Sophie knew there was one person she needed to tell first. She grabbed her coat and ran all the way to the community center. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to set. She didn't go to the auditorium. She knew Arthur wouldn't be there. He had told her once that he usually spent his late afternoons sitting on a bench near the city park, watching the birds and the people pass by. She found him there, sitting on a wooden bench under a large oak tree. He was feeding a few pigeons, looking relaxed in his overcoat. Sophie ran up to him, waving the letter. "Arthur! Arthur!" she called out, breathless. He looked up, squinting against the sun. When he saw her excitement, a slow smile spread across his face. "Well, you look like a young woman with good news." "I got it," she said, thrusting the letter toward him. "I got the full scholarship. I'm going to the music school." Arthur took the letter and read it carefully. As he read, his eyes crinkled at the corners. He let out a long, happy sigh. "I knew it," he said, handing the letter back to her. I told them in my letter that you have a gift that cannot be taught. You have a soul for the music." "Thank you," Sophie said, sitting down next to him on the bench. "Thank you for everything. For letting me practice. For believing in me. And for trusting me with the song." Arthur leaned back, looking out at the park. "You gave me something too, Sophie. For a long time, that piano hall was just a place of silence for me. It reminded me of what I lost. But now, when I walk in there, I don't just hear the silence. I hear Elena. And I hear you. You brought the music back to life." He reached into his pocket and took out a small, wrapped candy. He handed it to her, like a grandpa would. "You keep working hard. And when you have your first big concert, make sure you save 2 tickets for me." "I will," Sophie promised, unwrapping the candy. "One for you, and one for her." Arthur smiled and patted her hand. They sat there for a while as the sun went down, listening to the sounds of the city. The noise didn't seem so chaotic anymore. It felt like a rhythm, a song of its own. Sophie was going to be a great musician one day, but she knew she would never forget the cold judge who stopped her rehearsal, and the beautiful song that brought them together.